Good morning, friends. I hope you have solved the problem on your own. So let's start with the very basic first problem statement, where we have to use collections.shuffle method, in which and we have to sample a list of integers, say from 1 to 10, and we need a sample size of 4 with equal likeliness in each run. So I have got my IntelliJ open here. I have created a main class random sampling, and in the test, I have also created a random sampling test. So let's first of all let's start with the random sampling test here. Let me create a list of integers having 1 to 10. So I will use stream dot iterate starting with 1, and then use a lambda here and plus 1 dot limit 10l dot collect collectors dot to list. So I will just mark it as private final list integer data equals this. Control Alt L to format it. So we started with stream.iterate, starting with seed 1. We pass a lambda, which will increment by 1. Then we'll limit this with 10. So it means that it will collect all those like from 1 to 10 and pack it into a list of integer. I found that the stream.iterate is like quite useful, because if we have got a huge list of, let's say, 1 to say 50 or 1 to 100, by just using this small snippet of code, we can pack all this into a list of integer. So all these type of techniques, when you show to it actually gives a very good impression on the interviewer. Now let's take the sample size of int sample size of 4. Okay, so we are exactly taking the same example that's given here. We have a list of integers 1 to 10, and we need a sublist of sample size of 4. So let's work on this example first. Okay, so we have got data and sample size. Now let's create the private, we'll pass this as a constructor to our random sampling class, random sampling. I'll just call this as random sampling and pass it as a constructor to it. So here I will pass it as data and sample size. It gives an error, so I will use Alt Enter and I will create constructor here. So list data and sample size is created. Okay, and I will just go here and do a right click, maybe. So I'll go Alt Enter, bind constructor parameters to fields. So it will also create these two private field members here. So these are like shortcut. This is again a good way to demonstrate your skills, that you know that you have been working in IntelliJ and you know the shortcuts. So Alt Enter and then bind these constructor arguments to the actual private fields. So we have got this initialization done. So now let's start writing the test cases. But before I write any unit tests, let's create a setup method where I will just simply print out what is the data and what is the sample size before we proceed with the actual shuffling and doing the random sampling. So I'll do Alt Insert setup method. So setup method is created now. So I will the first statement would be original list. And actually I created a print utils method here, in which I am going to print a list. So we just passed any list of integer as an argument. So it will just print it out into a pretty way by just using some this printf statements. So I will call this method, so you can just do the same thing. It's just a util function. Okay, so I will just use this print int list and pass the data of so alt enter. It will do a static import, and I will use, so this would be our sample data that we'll create from the unit tests. Size %d and %n. Okay, so this is every test case that we run. This will be called first. It will show that what's the data, what is sample size, and then after this, following this line, it would be all the samples that we are creating. One thing to note here is that I prefer to use this printf, because it's if you use println and do a plus sign and all, it will result in a lot of string concatenations, which is not very performant efficient. That's why I use printf, because it will create this placeholders and embed it inside it. So there's no string concatenation involved. That's why it's preferable to use printf instead of println. Only when we don't have any like plus sign here, then it can be used println. But I always suggest to use printf statement whenever we have got some embedded data to be shown here. The same philosophy is done by the other loggers, that logger.app info or logger.error. They have got a similar type of concept. Okay, so let's write our first test method now. I'll mark it as test random sampling using collections.shuffle method. Okay. Similarly, I will use the same for display name. Random sampling using collections.shuffle method.